sparks would fly, like electrical, like an arc welder kind of. And then that robot backed up and almost knocked him down. He kind of fell back against a rock, and the two at the bottom took off and headed for the brush and stood out there about 30 feet from me. And then I shot 2 more arrows, and it was about the same time sequence that these 2 humanoids would, every time I'd shoot, they'd go back up into the brush, just almost out of sight from me.
Wow. So this bow, which is equivalent to a rifle, just hit him and made sparks, did not penetrate him whatsoever.
Didn't even put a dent in it. The interesting thing is, after this was all over, those arrowheads that struck those creatures, those robotic-like creatures, they actually were all twisted up, and they had scrapings on them, trace amounts of something that came off of the armor or the suit that these creatures were using. That's why Mr. Shrum was so determined to try to have those analyzed by a lab.
Wow.
And we'll talk more about that when we when we conclude.
All right. Well, let's do this. Let's take our last break, and when we get back, more to come here with Noe Torres, and we're talking about the Cisco Grove UFO encounter. So hold tight. We'll be right back. All right, and we're back here with our guest of the night, Noe Torres, and we're talking about the book Aliens in the Forest, the Cisco Grove, to come here with Noe Torres, and we're talking about that is rendering him or making him black out, not for long, but for a bit. And the clip we just heard, he took his compound bow, which is a very strong compound bow, and he shot the one that was releasing the vapor. And as we said before the break, this didn't penetrate him at all. It just made sparks. And afterwards, what did you say? The arrow tips actually had traces of the suit on it?
Yeah, when they were gathered up later and examined, they had streaks of some strange metallic substance on it. And that's why Mr. Shrum was very determined to have them analyzed by a lab, which they were, and we can talk about later.
So, at this point, did he shoot just one arrow, or did he continue shooting more?
He shot all 3 arrows at this one robot-like creature.
Okay.
And all 3 bounced off harmlessly off its chest, causing, a flash of light and then not much else, pushing the creature back a few steps, and also causing the 2 humanoids to scurry into the nearby brush and hide for a little bit before coming back out.
That's got to be frightening, because, you're in the tree, you have a weapon, usually you could take something out, but now your weapon is useless. You have no more arrows. You fired it at him, and it didn't do anything. So
he had a few more things that he thought of.
Okay, let's talk about that.
The battle was not over.
Let's talk about that. Let's get into that.
And one of the unique things, before we go on with the narrative of the encounter, is that many times people have analyzed the scenario of human beings versus a highly advanced, technologically superior race from outer space that might show up one day at our doorstep and intend to do us harm.
Yeah.
That perhaps adopting a very low-tech approach to battling these aliens might actually end up being, in the long run, the best way to go.
Mm-hmm.
So, interestingly enough, Mr. Shrum was forced into a low-tech situation. He had only these most primitive types of weapons. He had matches, he had the bow and arrows. So there have been many UFO cases where the witnesses had more sophisticated weapons like, guns and machinery, and none of it has worked. It has failed to work in the presence of these UFOs.
Yeah.
But something like a bow and arrow is the most fundamental weapon that mankind has devised, So he was forced into a low-tech scenario, was my point there. And so what he did next was he had noticed earlier in the encounter that when the robot-type creature arrived, one of the first acts that it had done was it brushed off the remaining embers of fire that were still kind of lit on top of those 3 rocks at the base of the tree.
So he had a campfire going.
Yeah, he had the little 3 signal fires that he tried to signal what he thought was a helicopter with. And they were still kind of glowing. So the very first thing the robot-like creature did was went up to those and he swept them off the top of the rocks.
Okay.
So Mr. Shrum got it in his mind that perhaps these creatures were scared of fire.
Mm-hmm.
And so he decided he was going to start burning stuff from up in the tree and throwing it down at them, as we're going to hear in clip number 450.
Well, I would assume Mr. Shrum was a smart man to do that, so let's take a listen here.
Then I ran out of arrows, so I only had 3 left. And I thought, well, that's when pomade haired is just, the cap I had on was just soaked with oil.
This is for your hair, pomade.
Yeah, from my hair, yeah, pomade. And I always carried all kinds of books of matches with me when I hunted. And so I lit that cap and it just blazed up, and I dropped it down the base of the tree. And just in that instant, they moved back about 12, 15 feet, and I glanced over at the ship that was over the canyon, kind of almost level with me, and it was almost out of sight. It was just like a star. It moved that fast.
Wow.
Just in that second. So then I got the idea that they're scared of fire. So I burned everything but my T-shirt and my jeans, and come to find out later on that it was 32 degrees out, and I was shaking and kind of overexposed for the weather. And at one time I had a bunch of change, and I threw it down, and they all kind of gathered around it. Well, after I shot or started burning stuff and throwing it down, and I even tied some of my shirt that I ripped up to a compass so I could try to hit some brush, because there wasn't nothing right underneath the tree. And I caught a little pile of brush on fire. I figured that would bring the cavalry. But when I ran out of stuff to burn, I headed for the top of the tree, and then it was a pretty sparse tree. I could see down to the ground, and I broke off the top and threw it down. And anytime I throw down or shake the tree, these humanoids would back up.
Now, you know what this makes me think of is almost like an interplanetary expedition where some other intelligence is sending a ship to Earth, a place they know where the gravity is, and they go there, they set up in the air, they deploy a scout ship to land their either humanoids or robots on the ground, and that's why they're so interested in the coins, maybe afraid of the fire. I don't know. It's a very interesting story so far, and we still got quite a bit to go through.
That's interesting that you should say that, Jamie, because for all we know, Mr. Shrum, as a representative of the human race, may have actually saved the planet, for all we know, that night in overcoming these ETs, if they were in fact an exploratory probe to our planet.
Yeah.
And he was able to fight them off. Perhaps it was a larger victory than just one man against the ETs. But what happened next is extremely even more interesting, and that is that another robot creature arrived.
Oh boy.
And he had managed to hold his own. You couldn't say that he was winning the encounter, but he was remaining out of their reach. And what had been happening before the arrival of the second robot was that every time the first robot would gas him and cause him to black out, the two humanoids would then attempt to climb the trunk of the tree. But he would awaken in time from being blacked out to be able to knock them off, kick at them with his speed and shake the tree and cause them to fall back down.
I see.
And that happened several times, but what finally happened was a second robot arrived on the scene, as we're going to hear in this next clip. Well, actually, this next clip is very interesting because he describes the climbing of the attempts to climb the tree by the humanoids. That's clip number 500. We'll hear that first, and then we'll go right to 550, the arrival of the second robot, if that's okay.
Yep. All right, let's listen to these two clips. Here we go.
Did you hear any noise between them, any communication? Was there any?
I heard kind of a cooing or almost like an owl, but it could have been an owl, that up there, but it just kind of fit in with them.
Well, so when you heard this owl-like sound, what did they do?
Well, they'd go on about their business, what they were, but they would try to climb up the tree. They're trying to boost each other up the tree, and then when I would, that's why I know I wasn't out very long at a time, because when I'd throw something down or when I was being gassed, they'd step back from the tree, and then they'd be, when I'd come to, I'd have dry heaves and kind of gasp for air, and they'd just be trying to climb back up on the tree. So that gave me a time that I wasn't out very long. Well, there was that when that light was out at the top of the ridge, I could hear coyotes, and I even howled like a coyote to see if make these guys think that there's more of me coming, to get out of there. And then I heard some of them yell, and at that time I thought, well, they're attacking everything, All
right, now that was interesting because he says he's seen, what would this be, the scout ship go out?
You mean the part where it zoomed way up into the sky? Is that?
Well, he said that during this he's seen one of the lights actually go out and move away.
Yes, whenever he would attack the creatures by, when he shot the arrows, when he was dropping down fire, he noticed at one point that the mothership, which had been hovering over the canyon right more or less in a line with him, it suddenly zoomed way up into the sky at an incredibly fast rate. So that was an interesting observation.
And did you want to play? Did you say to play 550? I'm going to accidentally play.
We'll go to 550 now, but I'm glad you paused right there, because I wanted to say that in this next clip we're getting to the climax of what happened. The arrival of the second robot actually precipitated the end of this encounter. So we're going to hear now the beginning of the final stages of this conflict. And that's clip number 550.
All right, let's take a listen.
After I went to the top of the tree, I had a military belt, and I moved it out to the last hitch and put it around me and the tree, so in case I did get gassed, I wouldn't fall down. And then like I said, I threw chains down and everything to try to distract them. And then finally, these two humanoids stepped back from the tree, and another robot came, and there was two just about the same place that the two humanoids were. And they stood facing each other, and flames just like lightning, and it real bright, and it just came between them. And then the gas was so thick coming up the tree that it would dissipate just about the time I got to me. But then that's when I'd start gas for air, and then when I woke up from that, it was light, but the sun hadn't come up yet, and I was just hanging by my belt, my head down, my feet down, and they were gone. Well, I knew I made it. I lived through the night.
Just to go back, did you fall asleep, or this gas? Did it overwhelm you?
Yeah, that's when it completely engulfed the whole tree and got up to me, and I don't know how long I was out, but it was just you could see just a dim glow of the sun on the clouds and stuff, not clouds, but in the sky. And then when I woke up, it was light, but the sun hadn't come up yet.
All right. Now, I'm just going to touch on there. So the two had combined their gas and sent it up the tree, and that was when he blacked out. When he woke up, at that time, it was just before sunrise. Or a lot of us can see that right before the sun's about to come up. You can kind of see, the higher up in the atmosphere is light, and then the sun rises. So he kind of passed out, and he wakes up during the daylight. Let me ask you, who is this that is interviewing him in these clips?
And I meant to say that earlier. My extreme apologies to my buddy Ruben Uriate, because that is him that we've been hearing in the background interviewing Mr. Shrum. So that's my co-author, Ruben. I
don't think I'm going to ever, being a white male, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to pronounce his last name right. I call Ruben Uriate. It's the best I can get.
That's close enough. It's a difficult name even for Hispanics to pronounce, so don't feel bad.
I speak a little Spanish, but the kind of words. So this had to be a relief of him seeing sunlight. And when the sun was up, were these creatures gone? Was the ship gone, the mothership, and
everything was gone? But the thing that he carried with him for a long time after this was he totally blacked out for a much longer period of time that last time when the two robots came together, and almost the entire tree was engulfed by this vapor. And then he blacked out the last time and didn't wake up until nearly sunrise. That's what caused him a lot of concern. He didn't know at that point if they had succeeded in getting to him, if they had taken him away and experimented on him and then brought him back and left him back in the tree.
Yeah.
He was very, very concerned. Had he been exposed to any kind of radiation? Could he suffer the effects of radiation sickness? Were there other physical effects that he might experience from what happened? So he was, when he came down out of that tree, he was not the same man as when he went back up, and it would affect him for years.
Yeah, it would change anybody's life. I would, that right there would totally give somebody PTSD for the rest of their life. I mean, just, it's one thing to talk about it, to research it, but to have it happen to yourself, to actually see it up front, is a totally different thing when you know these things are real and that they can get to you. That's just got to be on your mind 24/7.
I've spoken to many UFO witnesses who have, and it's so funny because they say the same thing almost in the same words, how until they had their own up-close and personal encounter with these unknown objects, until that point, they were among the multitude of people who scoff and make fun of.
Yeah, I was one of them.
People who have UFO encounters. So.
Yeah. I was one of them. In 2008, I thought all UFOs were either military or a natural phenomenon or, misidentification. But, I didn't have anything like this. All I seen was at arm's length, about 3,000 feet in the air. It's about the size of a softball. And it was an orange and yellow plasma-looking craft. It looked like a saucer, but it was like liquid. Like it had an exterior clear shell with different colored liquid inside. And, this thing had moved from one spot to another in just a blink of an eye. And then it kind of blinked out, came back on, and then blinked out. And as soon as it blinked out for good, I could see the clouds, like, right behind it. And that's when I knew, nothing on this earth can explain that. Nobody was flying that. It was not ball lightning. It was just so weird. And I came back in. It was, it was like 5 o'clock that morning. I came back in and, just started researching UFOs like crazy. So, but, seeing one and then seeing beings would be a totally different thing, so.
Mr. Shrum told us that before this incident, he had absolutely no interest in UFOs. He had read, of course, in the early 60s, there were a lot of UFO cases being reported on, so he had read about them. He didn't think much about them. He wasn't, actively calling himself a skeptic about them. He just really didn't care.
Yeah.
But when it came right up to him, and essentially when those creatures were grabbing at his feet and ankles, trying to bring him down, then it became extremely up close and personal for him.
So we have some clips left of him coming down from the tree. Can we listen to that?
Yeah, before we do that, I do want to mention a few things. His immediate sense was one of relief because the creatures were gone, and the UFO was gone, and he was still there, and touching himself all over in his body. Obviously, there were no immediately discernible physical problems. Although he intended to, and he did get a full physical examination and also make an effort to get tested for radiation exposure. But immediately, right after the incident, he noticed that the stuff he had thrown down was all around the base of the tree. There was a lot of brush that was burned from the stuff he set on fire. He saw that his arrowheads were there, and the canteen. At one point, he had thrown down his canteen and also his compass.
Was there any tracks where these humanoids had walked?
When he initially, when he gave testimony to NICAP, just a few months after the encounter, he did not mention any tracks. But when Paul Cerny arranged for a session of regressive hypnotherapy, it came out during his hypnotherapy that the whole base of the tree and the surrounding area was just littered with these strange footprints.
Wow.
He described them as kind of featureless, almost like a small child whose feet were bound up in cloth or moccasins. And they were all around the base of the tree. And that came out during his hypnosis later on, as did several other things. And one of the interesting things that of all the objects that he threw down at them, they took the coins. That was the only thing that they took. Everything else they picked up, examined, and threw back down to the ground. But the ETs took the coins. And it's like you had mentioned earlier, coins have a lot of significance to a human society, and they carry a lot of identifying information.
Yeah.
They have dates, they have people's faces, they have slogans or mottos, and so they would be of most interest when one culture is studying another.
Mm-hmm.
So it's significant to me that these ETs took Mr. Shrum's coins, and that was the only thing they took of everything he threw down.
I can say I guarantee hardcore skeptics out there would probably say that, okay, he got away from his party, he slept, up in this tree, and maybe he woke up with sleep paralysis in this place he was unfamiliar to, and, had a sleep paralysis encounter, but all the evidence points to the contrary, that this was absolutely a fact, with having all these prints and, all the stuff down the tree, and of course, the other eyewitness as well.
That's right. We have, of course, according to Mr. Shrum, he never fell asleep before he saw the UFO and it came right up to him. So, and also he had no history. They did a complete medical check on him.
Yep.
And released his records to NICAP. He had no history of any kind of epilepsy or any kind of problems of any kind. He was completely healthy, and medical examination after this revealed some bruising of his chest, probably when he was leaning against the tree branches and so forth. And he also, from being out in the cold with near freezing temperatures for many hours, he developed respiratory infection. But other than that, aches and pains, bruises, and a respiratory infection.
Yeah.
Of course, the family was very concerned he might have been exposed to some radiation, as has happened in other UFO encounters. But he never developed any symptoms. I think he actually received more harm from some of the toxic chemicals that he was using in his work with Aerojet. At that time, they were using a lot of chemicals which have since been identified as carcinogens and are no longer allowed to be used by industry. But what happened next was the involvement of the U.S. Air Force. There were two investigators from Wright-Patterson Air Base in Dayton, Ohio, that showed up on the scene, and they requested to talk to Mr. Shrum about his encounter. And when he met with them, it became clear to him and his wife, who was in the same room with him, that their purpose was not to take down his story and to try to arrive at truth. Yeah. Their purpose was to talk him out and persuade him that what he saw was just some kind of freak, ordinary, earthly explanation to that.
Yep, very familiar.
If we go to clip 700, he talks about what the U.S. Air Force told him.
Okay, let's listen to that right now.
Then what happened afterwards, Don? How did you talk to anyone else about your...
Well, my family, I told them. And then the only outside person at that time was a professor at one of the colleges. And my mother-in-law had gone... It was her professor when she was younger. So we told him the story. And he's the one that contacted the Air Force.
So what happened there, Don, for the Air Force?
Well, they made an appointment two posted representatives of the Air Force, and they tried to disillusion me. They said, well, you know, the Japanese might have had somebody up there, you know, they were still, you know, and they said there was Boy Scouts dressed up, you know, in costume just to scare somebody. And I said, yeah, I'm sure they're going to spend all night and keep a guy in a tree, you know. And, then they said the Army probably bivouacked up there and it was in a training camp. So my father-in-law was in the Air Force. So he called and found out there was no military in that area for any reason, because it was a pretty desolate area, and they tried to disillusion me every way they could. And they took the Arrowhead, the main one, and they said, well, we'll get back to you, and you can have this back as soon as we get through with it, which I never did. But when I went back up there during rifle season, I found the other arrow, the third one.
You found two then, and then you found the other one.
And when we went back, the area had been raked. And it is an area probably 50 feet around that tree, and there was cigarette packages and cigar butts, and so I know the Air Force checked it out pretty good.
That explains.
And they had an easy way to find it, because there's an orange circle around that tree where it caught little fires, and it was showing orange, so they had no problem finding it. And I marked on the map that they had where it was, the location.
You know, that's interesting. I had a guest on my show who was part of the Air Force's NBC crew, which is a nuclear biological cleanup crew. And they were sent out to clean up, you know, certain crashes or some things like this. I'm going to have to ask him what years he was a part of that, because he was based very close to Wright Pat, and I know he also lived in California, so I might ask him about this case, see if he knows anything. But you know what's weird, and what I would really like to know is why do these military personnel always come to people who've had close encounters or abductions and just tell them not to say something? It's almost like they're either working with them or they're trying to hide it from the public at large. I don't know. It's almost like they're either working with them or they're trying to hide it from the public at large. I don't know.
Well, this is very odd. As we heard Mr. Shrum just say, on the surface, during the interview with the Air Force, they kept telling him that what he experienced had a earthly explanation, that it was Boy Scouts in costumes, that perhaps the military, the Army, was having maneuvers out in the forest, and perhaps there were some stray Japanese soldiers from World War II era still living out there in the forest and terrorizing poor hunters. in the middle of the night. So they came up with all these weird attempts at explaining it, where he pinpointed the exact location of the encounter. They took his biggest piece of evidence, which was the one arrow of the three that seemed to have the largest concentration of a metallic substance at its tip, and the tip had been totally bent over, by the way. And so they took his strongest piece of evidence, said they would give it back to him, and which they never did, of course. And then, come to find out, when he went back to the scene 2 or 3 weeks later, the entire area had been raked clean. All the footprints, all the evidence had been collected from the scene, and there was absolutely no longer any trace whatsoever of his UFO encounter.
Yeah.
And then, probably the worst thing to Don Shrum, and the thing that to this day really, really disturbs him and makes him extremely angry, is that when the Blue Book, the two Blue Book investigators from Wright-Patterson that interviewed him, when they filed their report, which many years later they got through a Freedom of Information request, they got the report, and it says on there that the explanation that was arrived at by Project Blue Book to explain Mr. Shrum's encounter was psychological problem.
Wow.
There was absolutely no history whatsoever of any psychological problems. He was in perfect health, and that was just something that made him very, very angry. A previously very patriotic individual who had a great deal of respect for military institutions and so forth, but he felt really, really hurt.
Yeah,
he was
I bet.
really hurt.
I bet. So, a couple of questions left here. Now, we'll go back just a little bit. Now, when he got down from the tree, he ended up finding his other hunting partners, and they left the woods. Did he tell them right away?
He was so exhausted. He was able to get down from the tree, and he moved in the direction of the base camp they had established on Friday morning. And he didn't make it all the way back before he basically collapsed. But shortly after he fell down and was basically asleep, then one of his companions, one of the other hunters, Mr. Alvarez, Vincent Alvarez, happened upon him, saw a figure lying in the grass, and went over and saw that it was him, and he roused him, got him back on his feet, and walked him back to camp, where he proceeded to fall asleep for 6 hours solid.
Wow.
He was so exhausted, and he was, he was completely disheveled. He was dressed only in a T-shirt and his pants. He had set everything else on fire and thrown it down. So his companions later testified that they saw him in this horrible condition, and he had obviously been through something very traumatic. And then when he finally woke up after his 6-hour sleep and started telling them this incredible tale, Vincent Alvarez then made the immediate connection with a strange object that he saw coming down out of the Earth's atmosphere earlier in the evening. So he told Mr. Shrum, he said, I saw that object coming down. And he later, Mr. Shrum, he later gave Mr. Shrum a written affidavit, which we have a copy of, and was in the NICAP and MUFON files, where he states that he saw that object.
Right.
And so then they made it back. They made it back to their homes, and then Mrs. Shrum enters the picture, and she tells a remarkable tale to this day of how she had never seen her husband in such a distressed condition ever before or ever since, as when she saw him enter the door, having come back from this hunting expedition. And I wonder if we have time, Jamie, to listen to clip 750, the after effects of the incident.
Definitely. This is the after effects of what happened to him caused. Let's take a listen here.
I'd like to go there. I just wanted to ask you, how has this affected you? Did you have any nightmares or any...
Well, for a year, I had, screaming nightmares. I'd wake up yelling, those eyes, and I'd be just a cold sweat, just be drenched with sweat. And I even thought about, when I was up in the top of that tree, I thought about just jumping off and jumping down the canyon and just killing myself. But the only thing that kept me going is I had the little girl, my wife, and that kept me fighting.
Wow, that's tough to listen to.
The one thing that Ruben has told me in the many interviews that he's done with Mr. Shrum is how it physically affects him, even to this day, so many years later. It physically affects him. You can see him start to shake, and I watched the videotape of the interviews Ruben did. You can see Mr. Shrum start to shake, and his eyes become watery, and as he recalls this horrific experience.
Yeah, those eyes.
I've had a number of people tell me that perhaps he misjudged them, the ETs, that perhaps he misjudged their motives. But Mr. Shrum, from the word go, felt that there was nothing good that would come out of having these creatures get a hold of him.
Yeah.
And he maintains that to this very day. These were not friendly ET call home creatures. They were out. He feels convinced that they were intending to add him to their specimen collection.
Exactly, just like we do on other planets. We would, if we found a life form on another planet, say we found a rabbit on Mars, you don't think we would try to capture that rabbit no matter what and bring it back home?
The arrival of the second robot, I think, speaks volumes to the fact that they were really trying to get to him.
Yeah.